have Pascal Daphnis, who's going to give us a presentation entitled The Building of Community, the Case of Camden, New Jersey, 1950s through 1970s.
This? Is it presenting? You see it?
Yep.
All right, bet. Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about the emergence of a community just east of Philadelphia called Camden. In 2012, Camden was labeled the most violent city in the United States. Its unemployment rate was at 19%. That's 10% higher than the national average. So it fit all the modes of a stereotypical ghetto, right? Today I'm trying to unpack that. I'm trying to build a sense of pride for a community. So you're probably wondering, what's a kid from Miami doing talking about a city like Camden in New Jersey, in South New Jersey, right? Well, in 2017, I got the opportunity to work with Professor Alfred Young at the University of Michigan. Professor Alfred Young was conducting research at Camden, and he gave me 75 interviews from African-American residents. And it described their perspectives of unemployment in Camden and what it takes to get a good job. He basically was trying to create public policy measures that would improve social mobility for African-American and Puerto Rican residents in Camden. Another reason that I took on this project is because I wanted to tackle some of these questions, such as, what does solidarity look like in urban communities? And is solidarity only formed in moments of crisis? I think that the 1971 riot in Camden really helped me answer those questions, and I think it can even help other communities across the nation. So let's jump right into it. Idyllic Old Camden. Camden is like many cities in the United States. It started with a working class, African Americans who migrated to the north through the Great Migration, and Eastern European immigrants from Poland, from Russia, Albania, and Lithuania came to Camden to work at major corporations such as RCA Victor and Campbell's Soup. Sorry. I only remember the song in my head, you know? So just to give a perspective of old Camden and what it was like, Edna Martin, a Polish immigrant, remembers every Saturday the woman would come out on their houses and scrub, on their hands and knees no less, the marble steps, and then use the rest of the water to sweep the brick and sidewalk and the gutters. There was a sort of competition or community pride, I don't know which, that somehow made all of the neighborhoods try to outdo each other. Martin and the older white ethnic Europeans remember old Camden as idyllic or peaceful. Jobs were plentiful. RCRA and Campbell's Esther Book Penn provided opportunities for employment. Everyone seemed to get along. The Jews, the Poles, Italians, and Lithuanians kept to themselves, and it was good that way. However, things were not always so pretty. De facto segregation did exist in Camden. The color line was prominent. For example, blacks customarily traveled on the back of the bus. When they had the chance to see a performance at the Stanley Theater downtown, they were required to sit together in the upper balcony. One resident recalled that a nearby American restaurant would grant requests for a drink of water but destroy the glass afterwards. This photo below shows African-American children swimming at a swimming pool in Centerville, a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Camden. So African-Americans had been living in Camden at the same times as these Eastern European immigrants, but they still faced de facto segregation. And it's interesting because these Eastern European immigrants didn't have any conception of the color line or the racist attitudes of the Jim Crow South, but they still segregated themselves. Some people argue that this was a natural condition. Lewis Worth and the father of American statistics, Louis Hoffman, believed that African Americans would degrade northern cities, so he argued that whites should seal themselves off and protect themselves from black northern migration. deteriorating city. So in the 1950s, deindustrialization was occurring throughout the United States. Does everybody know what deindustrialization is? Have a good idea of it? No? So deindustrialization is basically the process of restructuring an economy. So RCA and Campbell's basically became, they started to outsource to other countries because labor production was cheaper, right? And this was something that was happening across all different parts of the city. In the 1970s, major cities like Chicago, Boston, and Pittsburgh had lost more than 1/3 of their manufacturing jobs. Camden's big brother, Philadelphia, had lost more than 40% of its manufacturing jobs between the 1960s and 1970s. From this graph, you can see that the white population in Camden was around 100,000 in 1940, right? And by 1972, the population decreased by almost 40,000. But the African American population almost quadrupled. So even though deindustrialization was occurring and there was a loss of working class jobs, this wasn't the reason. Camden's deindustrialization process was actually really lethargic. There were still jobs in Camden, manufacturing jobs in Camden in the 1940s and 50s, right? So there's still a working class grit. So what could have possibly made all of these Eastern European immigrants leave Camden? Sociologists argue that white flight in Camden was accelerated due to a subsequent riot in 1971. So I want to talk a little bit about the African American community in Camden during the 1950s and the 60s. So Mayor Alfred Pierce wanted to attempt to revitalize Camden through urban renewal projects that would condemn the most blighted areas of the cities. Of course, the most blighted areas of the city included where African American and Hispanic residents lived in southern and central Camden. Poppy Sharp, who is pictured on the left, he's the one with his mouth open, not with the cool shades. Poppy Sharp, a longtime African American resident of Camden, challenged Mayor Alfred Pierce's urban renewal projects. Poppy Sharp was the leader of the BPUM movement, which stands for Black People's Unity Movement. The goals of BPUM was to find suitable housing and self-respect for the African American community. BPUM staged multiple housing protests in Camden in the 1950s by occupying affluent hotels, the urban renewal projects of building a 2-story shopping mall in the most condemned, the most blighted areas of Camden, and voicing their concerns through petitions and community suits that asked for new housing following the condemnation of the African American neighborhoods. So Poppy Sharp was basically a civic leader throughout the 1960s and 70s in Camden. Oof, all right, into the meat of it. Okay. Justicia ahora, justice now. On July 3rd, 1971, 2 Camden police officers, Gary Miller and Warren Worrell, stopped a 40-year-old Puerto Rican motorist for driving in an erratic manner. The man, who identified himself as Horacio Jimenez, was actually Rafael Gonzalez from nearby Penns Grove, New Jersey. According to an eyewitness, Rodriguez Gonzalez was driving down Benson Street when he slowed to speak to a pedestrian, consequently stopping traffic. Police signaled for Rodriguez Gonzalez to pull over. Miller asked for his license, and when Rodriguez Gonzalez hesitated, probably because of an active traffic warrant pending against him, Miller told him to get out of the car. As Miller patted him down, Rodriguez Gonzalez turned and asked, "Why are you searching me for?" Another eyewitness, who was close enough to the events, said that Miller responded by hitting Rodriguez Gonzalez with his fist and then with his nightstick. Rodriguez Gonzalez fell to the ground as both officers beat him with their nightsticks and kicked him in the abdomen. Miller and Worrell proceeded to club Rodriguez Gonzalez with their nightsticks and dragged him by his feet to the patrol car. A crowd began to gather and watch as Miller and Worrell cuffed Rodriguez Gonzalez, to which someone in the crowd shouted, "You shouldn't have done that. This is what can cause a riot." Hispanic activists, including young Lords Galberto Medina, pressed for an investigation into the suspension of the police officers involved. The mayor at the time refused to press for an investigation, and the chief of police also refused to suspend the police officers. A moment of solidarity. Poppy Sharp restored the support of Camden's black community and publicly confirmed the alliance between the Puerto Ricans and African Americans, announcing, "We have an awful lot in common. Blacks and Puerto Ricans must unite now under one cause, freedom." Another BPUM member, Omar Davis, said, "Only by unity can we lift this thing. Together we are 75% of this city. Neither of us can do this by ourselves." Davis deferred to the Puerto Rican leaders, however, telling them, "Whatever decision you make, we're going to be there with you." This kind of helped answer one of my questions that I had earlier on in this project. When Omar took to the stand in front of City Hall and he said, "Whatever decision you're going to make, we're going to stand with you," he didn't co-opt the protest. He didn't take the protest and make it a black thing. He made it a Camden thing. In Camden, police brutality was not a black or Puerto Rican problem. It was a community problem that required interracial unity. Poppy Sharp also spoke. "As a black man and a member of this suppressed community, I know I speak for all blacks, including the silent ones, because they know the next day it might be one of them whose rights are violated. All members of the black community will begin today by wearing black armbands in support of the Puerto Rican community and continue to wear them until unity, justice, and equality prevails. We support the Puerto Rican community because we too have been victims of police brutality. We must work together until justice becomes a part of the Camden community." Notice how he's using the word community, and he doesn't refer to the community as a ghetto, and he doesn't try to use neoliberal practices such as Alfred Pierce of urban renewal projects that would displace many residents. It's really a reclamation of power and agency that hasn't really been recognized in the United States for some time. So in conclusion, protests began in the early morning around 8 a.m. At 3:30, a 2-hour downpour began, and some of the demonstrators ran into City Hall for cover. Still, the crowd remained peaceful, and shouts of "Justicia ahora" continued. At 5:30 p.m., the mayor finally agreed to meet with a delegation of 6 Puerto Ricans and 4 observers if the demonstrators would go home, but the demonstrators did not go home. At 8 p.m., the mayor finally arrived at City Hall, and they went up to the 18th floor of City Hall, where the shouts of the protest shouts could not be heard. But at this point, the crowd was already restless. Mario Rodriguez Gonzalez told the press later, "The longer you keep a crowd waiting, the harder it becomes to control." The Puerto Rican leaders and many other members of the community blamed the violence that would come into fruition on the mayor for delaying the meeting. If the mayor had engaged with the demonstrators from the onset, on the onset of the protest, he may have been able to placate the anger from the community and avoid the violence entirely. He kept those people waiting for 10 hours. He kept them waiting in the heat and the rain and avoided sitting down with them. During the meeting, a fight at a nearby bar spilled over into the demonstrating crowd, and suddenly windows were being broken and a spree of looting began. The police chief ordered leaders to clear the crowd from City Hall within 5 minutes, or negotiations for the suspension of Officer Worrell and Miller would not continue. By the time the leaders reached the street, the demonstrators had begun throwing rocks, bricks, and trash cans at the station police officers. Medina, speaking with the press later that night, said the police attacked women, men, and children, and even senior citizens. The looting and rioting in Camden lasted for 3 nights. 3 people were shot and 87 people were injured. For the Hispanic community, Rodriguez-Gonzalez's attack became a galvanizing force to become civically engaged and negotiate for better treatment within the Camden city. They found allies with the African American community who also had similar experiences with not only racial discrimination but police harassment as well. Camden's 1971 riot was not only a moment of resistance against the political structures, but it was also a moment of solidarity between the African American and Hispanic community. The minority community in Camden showed that despite, right on time, right on time. I'm finishing, last sentence. The minority community in Camden showed that despite the loss of the old idyllic Camden, a new community was emerging, one with black and brown identities that met complacency from its political leaders with resistance. In conclusion, I just want to acknowledge my professor and my leader, Donald Carter, professor of Africana Studies. Man, you brought me through the ringer with this project, all right? But all power to you, respect, because you really pushed me, and I appreciate that. I also want to recognize Jorge Hernandez, my writing coach, for always reading my drafts, and Kenneth Garrett, works at Breakthrough Miami. I got to shout out my boys. Kenny, thank you for helping a Haitian kid from Miami make it to college. I appreciate you, and I love you, brother. Thank you. Questions?
I grew up in Palmyra, New Jersey, which is 8 miles away from Camden. My first girlfriend, Stephanie Fuller, was from Camden. I was in Camden when I wasn't supposed to be in Camden, right? So I remember all of this. It's fascinating. I remember all of this. You just took me back home, you know? And it's interesting because there are political dynamics as well. There was a rod at the top that fed the discord in the community, but it also extended itself over to Philadelphia as well, where the police were worse than any hoodlum you run across on the street. So you brought me back home, so thank you.
Riots are always considered a crazy act of a group of people. How is it represented in Camden by different constituencies, one? And two, is it represented nationally? In other words, was there a national noise about the Camden riot?
Okay.
As this thing like the other riots in Chicago and elsewhere?
So I'll answer the second question first. So the Camden riots is kind of unknown unless you're from Philly or from even New Jersey, right? Mainly because it was a Puerto Rican riot, and often riots in the United States have been racialized to being only with African Americans. And there's also this perception of police brutality only happens to darker skinned people. So this is one of the instances that, where it was actually, I never got a chance to actually see Horacio Jimenez's face or his phenotype, but this is actually an instance where another ethnicity was brutalized by the police. And as far as how it was received, what was your first question again?
The pejorative associations usually apply to riots.
Right.
Because riots don't come from some crazy people in the street.
Right.
It comes from deeper social significance.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are differences in the community in Camden and elsewhere about, some people call it revolutionary, some people call it crazy, bad people on the streets robbing people or things like that. You know how they usually associate riots, you know?
Right. I would say that riots are actually a language of the oppressed, right? So I think that's what Dr. Martin Luther King called it. So, yeah.
At the top of the presentation, you said can communities emerge only out of trauma? Did your opinion after completing this project? Did you think these riots and this instance of police brutality was a unifier for two groups that live together, or was it a moment that a lot of people's eyes got turned to a community that had always been sort of together and bonded?
I think that
shared sort of struggle.
The best way I could describe the Hispanic community and the African American community before the riots was they were neither friends nor enemies. They did not have African Americans did not have the same relationships like Puerto Ricans didn't reinforce the color line like the Eastern Europeans did, but proximity and shared struggle definitely did not like create unifications. They had moments where they tried to create labor unions with each other, but it mostly fell through, right? So I would think that this was like the police brutality case was definitely a catalyst for community building and more action between the two groups.
Camden has made something of a comeback now.
Yeah.
They still don't have the same industrial base they used to back in the 20s through the 70s. Once Campbell Soup closed down, it took the city a while to come back, but now it's come back quite nicely now. So
Yeah. There's hope.
Camden rocks.
Right on. Right on.
And this was a particularly bad place, as I understand it, for labor.
Yeah.
So that those, one of the things you write about is comparing this Camden with other places where in fact these groups did come together in the trade union movement.
Right.
Where that didn't happen in Camden.
Right. Yeah, there was a case in Miami, like Puerto Ricans and African Americans did unionize in the garment district for better pay and better wages. So, yeah, definitely. Cool. Any more questions?
Thank you, Pat.